So, amongst the many things that happen this time of year, especially at places like high schools and middle schools, where you've got that new group of students coming in, the sixth graders or the freshmen, one of the things that you have to do in those situations is you have to teach those students the tradition of the school that they are now a part of. Because that's how traditions not only continue, but it's how you take a bunch of random people and turn them into a group, right? One of the best ways, if you want to turn just a random group of people into an actual group, is to give them some shared experiences, give them some traditions, give them some rituals to bind themselves around. It's one of the reasons why we keep coming back here on Sunday mornings, and some things are the same and some things are different, but it's those traditions, those things that are the same that you can rely on happening Sunday after Sunday that keep us grounded. So in schools, there's all sorts of traditions that, of course, come along. Some grow over time. Some are taught, formally at assemblies where you learn the cheers. Some are taught informally amongst the students. Some of the traditions are good. Some of them are maybe not so good. Those happen too. I remember I was thinking about this, and I remembered back to my high school days, and when you are the only high school of your size in the middle of basically nowhere in eastern Montana, the high school is a big deal, right? I mean, we didn't have a college, so we didn't have college teams or anything like that. So high school sports were a big deal. If anything big and important happened, it happened at the high school. It was the biggest building in town. It held the most people, and all of that. So the high school really was the center of the world in eastern Montana, where I grew up. And there were a lot of traditions around it, some of which went back literally for generations. One of the traditions that went back for a long time actually came at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, there would be kind of a big celebration, and the junior class and the outgoing senior class and the up-and-coming senior class would host an event. And one of the events that we hosted several events, but one of the events that we hosted was a giant bonfire, which sounds like a really good idea, right? Let's give a bunch of high schoolers cardboard boxes and matches and see how it goes. This has been a tradition for a long time, and the goal basically for each class in the competition was basically to outdo the other one. So there was really a period of about 2 weeks in Miles City where you could not find a cardboard box to save your life. Because there were at least 100 kids in each class around scavenging for all of the boxes they could find so that we could eventually set them on fire. Again, good plan. Well, my year, where we were the junior class, first off, my class had a bit of a reputation. And we had a bit of a reputation for occasionally finding ways to get ourselves in trouble. And in fact, I was actually at my wife's class reunion. She was a year behind me. I was at her class reunion talking with some friends of hers, and they really started to rag on my class, not realizing that I was actually a member of the class that they were making all the fun of. And I'm like, but I also couldn't argue with them because they were also right. We were a bunch of misfits. So it came to be our year, our junior year. We were all gathering our cardboard and doing all the things that we were supposed to do. And then a few members of the group decided that what they really needed to do was find out how much the senior class had set aside so we could see where we were in the competition. They got impatient. And decided they really didn't want to wait a couple of more days, and they wanted to see what they had. Well, the senior class had arranged to use some space at the local Napa hardware store that one of their parents owned to store all of their cardboard. So a few of the members of our class, I was not among them, by the way, but a few members of our class thought it'd be a really great idea to go down there in the dark of night at like 3 o'clock in the morning and see if they could find out and get an idea of how much they had put away. And when they got down there, of course, they found that at 3 o'clock in the morning, the doors were locked. So that, I know. And I don't exactly know what happened. I'm not exactly sure I ever really understood it. But somehow, despite the locked doors, they managed to get themselves inside. Not knowing that this being a business and it's still, and it being, still technology existing, that may cause a problem. That there might be this thing we call an alarm. And there was. And that is how basically most of the the junior class student council members found themselves getting arrested on a random Tuesday afternoon or morning in 1996. I will tell you, by the way, that is no longer a tradition at the high school. We didn't actually get to do it that year, and I'm just going to say it's actually one of a couple of different traditions that died on our watch. Maybe for the best. Again, setting giant things on fire, maybe not the best idea. But that's what traditions do. Traditions are important because they help us know who we are, they help us know where we belong, and when they're practiced well, it helps us be part of the group. Where we get ourselves in trouble is when we stop practicing them well. Paul in his scripture today is doing something really interesting because Paul also has in the church of Corinth a very different, diverse group of people. The people that Paul is writing this letter to, some of them are very new. Not all of them, and in fact, most of them are not actually Jews. They come from the Gentile traditions, and they are very much still figuring out who they are as a group, who they are as a church, what it means to be them, right? And so Paul, throughout this, actually both letters to the Corinthians, is one of the things he's doing, he's basically telling them and educating them, like, this is who you are. And this passage stands out because he's basically telling them that you are part of this tradition that dates all the way back to Moses and before that. Now, this was probably actually news for a lot of them, because at that time, the understanding would have been, if you are part of the tradition of Moses, it's because you're actually Jewish, right? That is not something that very many people take on. It is something you are born into. And so Paul's trying to help them understand, even though you may not have been born into this tradition, you may not have been born into this family, you are a part of it now. And you are a part of it not really because of you, you are a part of it because of Jesus. And he does some really interesting things here. He casts the movement of God's people through the Red Sea after they flee Egypt. He casts that as a version of baptism. He talks about when he talks about the spiritual food and the water. He's talking about the manna from heaven and all the other miracles that were happened during those times. And then he recasts them in light of communion. Right? And he says, even those people back then practiced a form of baptism and a form of communion as you do today, because all the baptism and communion was well practiced in the church even in these early days. And he basically continues this tradition that people will have in the early church where they really do understand Jesus as that next new Moses. So if Jesus is the new Moses, and you get to be brought into the fold, into the family through Jesus, well, then you get to bring along everything else that happened before, right? So again, a lot of these people are probably a little bit surprised to learn that even though they didn't grow up or were not born into the Jewish tradition or anything like that, they're a part of it now. And which means that the lessons and everything that was learned before now become lessons for them too. The traditions of before, some of them anyway, not all of them, but some of the traditions from before get to become their traditions as well. And he reminds them of a story that even if you are probably not all that well versed in the Jewish tradition at the time or today, is a story you probably know. And he talks about this idea of idolatry. And he's talking specifically there about the time when God's people get a little impatient. Moses has gone up on the mountain to talk to God. He's been gone for a long time. They're not sure what's going on. They get impatient. They get a little unrowdy. And that's when Paul's brother Aaron decides to give them something to do. And that's where we get the story of the golden calf. So when he talks about idolatry, what he's talking specifically is about this time when God's people got impatient and decided not to wait for the thing that was the real thing that they needed to be waiting for, and instead just make up something for themselves to do, make up a substitute. And we get the story of them choosing the substitute instead of waiting and being patient, and what the repercussions of that was, which of course was God was not happy with them. And so he's using this as a tradition. He's saying this is part of our tradition, which means it's also an opportunity for us to learn from the mistakes people made before us. And we should learn from those mistakes so that we ourselves don't repeat them. Because people at this time, Paul's people, the people in Corinth, are themselves waiting. They're not sure what's going to happen. They don't know how long it's going to be before Jesus comes back. They don't know they're going to be waiting an awfully long time, like we know. And he's worried about them, the same thing. He's worried about them getting impatient and turning to something less than they should. He's saying, no. We've done that before. You're part of a tradition where we've already been down that road. We know it's not good. We know it doesn't lead a good place. Let's not make that same mistake they made all those many years ago. Instead, let's soldier on and make brand new mistakes. Because brand new mistakes are a lot more fun than repeating old mistakes. And yes, God's people and the Corinthians themselves and Paul himself and everybody else will go on to make brand new mistakes. But we don't have to repeat the ones from before. The problem that God's people had at the time of the golden calf is their patience failed them. Oftentimes, when we make the mistakes that we all make mistakes, right? And there are small mistakes that we make in life that are not necessarily a big deal. Leaving the house and forgetting your wallet at home is kind of a pain and it's a mistake, but it's not really all that big a deal as long as you can go back and get it, right? We make small mistakes. The ones that tend to stick with us, that we tend to remember, are the ones where we make a little bit bigger mistakes. And those mistakes usually come from a couple of places. And they come from a couple of places, the two places that we've actually already talked about. When I think back on my life and the mistakes that I have made that I probably regret the most, and the ones that I've made that have stuck with me the most, it is times when either my patience failed me and I got in a hurry, or my kindness failed me and I started treating myself and others in a way that I ought not. We talked about patience and kindness on purpose at the beginning of this, in case you didn't know, because I knew this Sunday was coming and I knew I wanted to talk about mistakes. And when you think about the root cause, the things that where those mistakes tend to come from, more often than not, they come from one of those two places. Either we fail to have the patience we ought to have, or we fail to have the kindness for ourselves or others that we ought to have. And when one of those two things fails, or God forbid both, that's when things happen that most of us would probably prefer didn't. Patience is a big one and oftentimes some of the biggest mistakes we will see that happen in life or around the world come from a failure of patience. So in 1967, there was an oil tanker called the Torrey Canyon. And this was one of the first, what's called a Suezmax ship. So this is basically the biggest ship you can put through the Suez Canal. And it was moving oil from Kuwait to England because that was its job. And it had been doing it for a number of years. Now, there's a lot of things that come with big ships like this. One, they're very efficient, helps keep prices down, that sort of stuff, and that way they're good. The other side of it, though, is they're also just really big, right? And really big ships are good for some things and not good for other things. And one of the things they're not really good at is turning or slowing down. And so long as that's not important that you do either one of those things quickly, generally you're probably okay. Well, in the fall of 1967, the Torrey Canyon was making its way. It had gotten through the Suez Canal and through the Mediterranean and gotten to England. And it had an appointment because, again, it's a very big ship, which means it had an appointment for when it could dock where it needed to dock, and it had to dock at a certain time because the tides had to be so high, otherwise the ship literally wouldn't fit. And if they missed the window for when they could drop it off, it was going to be 3 days before the window would open up again, and they would basically just sort of have to sit and hang out. Well, the captain decided that he really, they were running a little bit behind because of some weather, and the captain decided he really didn't want to sit in the English Channel for 3 days if he didn't have to. And so he looked at his chart, and this again, 1967, so it's all on paper, there's no fancy computers or anything like that, but he looks at his chart and all that, and thinks he sees a shortcut. Mistake number one, right? So he gets impatient and he says, well, I think I can, if we take this shortcut and trim off this amount of miles off the trip, we shouldn't have any problem making our berth on time. So he decides to go ahead and tell the first mate, okay, this is what we're going to do. You're going to go this way. And then he goes to bed. And the first mate looks at the charts and says, okay, and he kind of charts out where he needs to go. What the first mate doesn't recognize, and what nobody else really kind of recognizes at the time, is because they weren't planning to go that way, they weren't actually carrying the kind of detailed charts you would want to carry on board the ship to go the way they were going. They had detailed charts for the path they were supposed to go on, which means there are certain things that they didn't know. And one of the things they didn't know is apparently there's a bunch of rocks out there. And one of them formations is called the Seven Sisters. And the next morning, as they were going through, in the middle, like in daylight, like where you can see, they figure out, unfortunately, rather abruptly, that there was something out there that they didn't know where it was, and they figure it out when they run into it. And this becomes actually the first time that a tanker of this size runs aground in the way that it did. And of course, big tankers full of momentum and energy don't stop very quickly and don't stop very well, and it didn't. And of course, it led to all of the problems you would expect a tanker loaded down to oil to have in the middle of the English Channel, which of course is the oil that was supposed to be on the inside quickly starts to become on the outside, where it's not supposed to be. Now, what's interesting about this is, one, if we're going to put a bunch of oil on a bunch of ships, this is eventually going to happen, you would think, right? Obviously. Apparently, though, nobody had actually really planned for this, because it was at that moment that they figured out nobody had actually really decided what to do should this ever happen. So now we have a problem because we were impatient, and now we've created a big problem. But not only that, we've created a big problem that apparently nobody saw coming, and now we don't know what to do. And that's when, the Royal Air Force got involved and said, we know what to do. Oil burns. Through the course of the next 2 days, the Royal Air Force dropped 161 bombs, 16 rockets, and 15 tons of napalm onto the Torrey Canyon. Here's the problem. Torrey Canyon, yes, oil burns. Water doesn't. And so what they figured out relatively quickly, though they just kept trying it anyway, is they could get it to set itself on fire, which is what they wanted, but then there's these things called waves that would just come and put the fire immediately out, which is why they kept doing it over and over and over and over again. Obviously, that did not work in the way that they expected it to, or way they hoped it would. And again, they didn't really have any other plans, and they didn't know what else to do, and didn't have any equipment to do anything about it, even if they did. When it was all over, they figured out, they tried to, when they all over and they did the investigations that they do and figured out what went wrong. They found there was a couple of technical issues with the ship that they hadn't really discovered before that were the problem. But the main blame was put on the captain, who was trying to make up time, who was being impatient and trying to get to his destination. And so he got the bulk of the blame, saying, you probably should have just waited the 3 days, as hard as that may have felt at the time. They also found out at the time, because shipping, apparently maritime laws are really weird. If you don't know this, the law of the sea is very weird. It's been built up over the a couple of last centuries. And one of the things they figured out is at the end of the day, there was actually no liability on behalf of the shipping company, because their liability was actually limited to the value of the ship after it had been salvaged, the one they dropped 1,500 pounds of napalm on. So they discovered that the liability and the value of the ship by the time it was all said and done was about $150. And that's all anybody could recover from it. Now, because of this, and if you remember, if you remember if you kind of remember forward a few years, probably the oil spill that we mostly all remember is the Exxon Valdez. By the time you get there, if you haven't noticed, if you didn't pay attention to that when it was happening, if you didn't notice, we didn't actually drop bombs on the Exxon Valdez, which is probably a good thing. By the time we get there, they actually had better procedures. They actually had things to do. They'd actually thought about it. They'd actually planned ahead a little bit. And so with that one, there was actually a response that made at least a little more sense. And some plans have been put in place and some equipment have been put in place. Though the Exxon Valdez, if you kind of dig back into its history, basically the disaster originated in the same way. Somebody was impatient to get somewhere, and they needed to be more patient. We can learn from our mistakes. And in fact, we need to learn from our mistakes, the big ones and the little ones. Because the thing about life is, mistakes happen. And while we want to believe, especially when we make those bigger mistakes that lead to some regret, we'd like to believe we're only ever going to make that mistake once. But I think if we're honest about ourselves and honest about our history, the truth is that's rarely how it works. Normally, I know me, I've got to make a mistake 3, 4, 5 good times before I finally learn the lesson. But every time I do, there's an opportunity to learn. There's an opportunity to make sure that it's not as bad next time. There's an opportunity to think about why it is that I got the place that I got. What circumstances were created that led me to be in a place I didn't want to be, and is there a way in the future of avoiding it? So again, I don't have to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. I can move on to brand new ones. The gospel story is a story of people, and in fact, the entire Bible story is a story about people making mistakes over and over and over again. Some unintended, some intentional, some small, some very, very big, right? If we even just looking at the gospel story, if you look at the disciples, the 12 that were around Jesus, who were supposed to become, the people that would launch this whole church, and were the people who would launch the entire movement that we and a billion other people are a part of today. If you look even just at those 12 disciples, you're going to figure out very quickly that Jesus was not hanging out with the varsity team, right? I mean, just look at Peter. Oh my gosh, I love Peter so much because he screws up all the time. He's constantly putting his foot in his mouth. He's constantly making mistakes. And there Jesus is, often, sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently, helping Peter see what he did and how he might do it different. The Bible and the story of God and God's people is a story over and over and over again of God's people making mistakes and God coming along to help us understand, to teach us, to show us how to possibly avoid doing it again in the future. We are blessed to be made by and loved by a God that knows that we're not perfect. Because we're not. I'm not and you're not. That's not how it works. We're going to mess up. We're going to fall short. We're going to do things we wish we hadn't done, and we're not going to do things that we wish we had done. This is life. It's part of the deal. God knows this better than we do. And the hope that we have and the faith that we have tells us that God is there for us even when we mess up. And what God wants from us when we mess up is to learn from the experience of the mistake. That's the truth about mistakes. They happen and they will. And the only time a mistake really and truly becomes something terrible is when we fail to learn and grow because of it. Because that's the truth about mistakes. Mistakes are opportunities to grow. So in a minute, we're going to join together at the table behind me. And it's the same table of communion that Christians have gathered around for 2,000 years. It is in many ways the same table that the people wandering in the desert after the Exodus gathered around as well. It is the table of grace. It is a place that we come to literally taste the love, grace, and forgiveness that God has for us. None of us come to that table perfect. None of us come without a little bit of guilt or a little bit of shame or a little bit of questioning. None of us come with completely clear hearts. We are all carrying around our past mistakes with us. Sometimes they feel really big, sometimes they feel small. It does not matter how you come to the table, because God already knows your heart and your mind. What matters is that we go. What matters is that we take advantage of the grace and the peace and the forgiveness we are offered, so that we ourselves can grow and continue to develop as the disciples God calls us to be. So recognize and be honest with yourself about the mistakes you've made. We should not hide from them, but what we should do is ask ourselves the question, what is it that I am supposed to learn from this now? How is it that I need to be better? How is it that I need to love a little bit more? How is it that I need to be more kind or more patient or whatever it is? And then we come to the table to receive the bread and the cup, to receive the gift from God, where the source of where all of our kindness and our patience and our love and our peace comes from. That is the faith, that is the trust, that is why we are here. Amen.
Amen.